We are having this conversation in the backdrop of the recent murder of Charlie Kirk. There was a couple of famous surveys that came out this week. 34% of Harvard students believe that violence is an appropriate response to some forms of speech. What you're seeing there is people finally coming out from under a
Mm,
Christ-centered idea, and without there being a Judeo-Christian foundation to everything that we believe. There are so many foundational elements of this system that we're all a part of that just disintegrate, and that is predictable. And I feel like we haven't really dealt with that.
Hi, welcome to Jeremy Pryor's podcast, or what I like to call Jeremy Pryor Unfiltered. I'm his daughter and producer, Kelsey Gall, and we are excited to bring you seasons of content all the way from Tolkien to theology, from business to family. If you like to contemplate deep philosophical ideas across a wide range of topics, you've come to the right place. Make sure you give us a follow so you don't miss out on future episodes.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. I am here with my friend Phil Cotnoir. Phil and I have done a few podcasts together. He's one of my favorite conversation partners. So, Phil, thanks for jumping on the podcast today.
Great to be here.
Yeah. Well, we are having this conversation in the backdrop of the recent murder of Charlie Kirk. But I'd like to have a conversation that is going to be very timely for any time. But this is part of what's stirring up, the conversation, I think. And apocalyptic events, even little micro apocalypses, whether it's like a cancer diagnosis or a tragedy, like what happened to Charlie, and what the meaning of the kind of ripples of the meaning are hitting people. You have that unveiling, right? Isn't that what the apocalypse is? Just sort of an unveiling where you sort of see the other side for a minute or get glimpses of what is really meaningful. And these are
Yeah.
really helpful times to take a big step back and say, okay, is there anything I'm just missing and not seeing? Like, it's the ability to see something differently because something got unveiled. So that's I really have been drilling into lots and lots of topics that are suddenly becoming a lot clearer to me, or things I can think about more clearly because of what's happening. It's the only real silver lining that I'm experiencing from such a incredible tragedy. We feel
Yeah.
so badly for for everyone affected, especially Erica, his wife, and his kids, and what this means for them. And this is very dark, and there's a lot of things in our whole culture this is unveiling that I think is really hard to deal with. But I think I want to take a big step back and just think about, like, how does this unveiling impact the way that we engage with topics like this? So I wrote a little Substack, and I'm always looking for what are things I can repent of, which is just to change your mind. Like, are there things that I'm just like, and there's a whole nother thread that I've gone really down, and we have multiple meetings and things set up for how to engage the public square. That's one area where I've been deeply like thinking, and but there's also just this conversation around what what about the hesitation as Christians to engage in these conversations because they're categorized or labeled or coded as cultural or culture war or political. And hey, we're ministers of the gospel. We don't get involved in the culture war. We don't get involved in politics. And so
Right.
that's been really confusing for me, I think, for a lot of people. And so this is really the essence of the essay that I wrote. I'll read this to you guys, and then I want to get Phil's reaction. The war is not cultural, it's religious. For years, I misunderstood the battle lines. I thought we were fighting a culture war, a clash of values, politics, and social norms. As a disciple of Jesus Christ, I had little interest in that fight. My calling was to spread the gospel, not to win cultural debates. But I was wrong. I made a categorical error. What I saw as cultural or political was often something deeper: religious. Religions offer comprehensive worldviews, lenses that shape how people see every issue from morality to justice. I now believe that much of what we label as cultural or political in public debates is in fact religious. This realization has reshaped my approach to engaging in the public square. Three convictions guide me. Leftism functions as a religion. The New Testament provides a clear strategy for confronting false religions, and Christians must hold one another accountable to oppose its spread. So first of all, leftism is a religion. Leftism, as I use the term, is not merely a political stance or cultural trend. It is a worldview with dogmatic beliefs, rituals, and moral imperatives that rival traditional religions. Like a religion, it offers a vision of ultimate purpose, social utopia through ideological conformity, and demands loyalty to its tenets, often punishing dissent with social ostracism or worse. This became starkly clear after the tragic murder of Charlie Kirk, a conservative commentator known for peacefully debating his views. The response was telling. Liberal voices like Ezra Klein and Bill Maher, while not Christians, praised Kirk's approach to dialogue, with Klein writing, quote, Charlie Kirk was practicing politics the right way, and Maher chastising leftists, saying, you're what's wrong with this country. Yet across social media, many on the far left celebrated Kirk's death, a husband and father targeted for his beliefs. This wasn't just political disagreement. It was a zealous, almost ritualistic rejection of an ideological heretic. Such fervor suggests a religious devotion, not a mere policy dispute. So that's the first piece. Number two, the New Testament call to confront false religions. How should Christians respond to such a worldview? The New Testament offers guidance. 2 Corinthians 10:5, Paul writes, quote, we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. This is not a call to silence or violence, but to boldly challenge ideas that oppose the truth of Christ. Staying silent out of fear of offending adherents of a false religion or being labeled too political is not an option. Imagine if Islam or another faith were captivating millions of young Americans, yet Christian leaders refuse to speak out, worried about alienating potential converts or appearing divisive. We'd call that cowardice. Yet many Christian leaders have done exactly this with leftism, treating it as a cultural or political issue rather than a rival worldview that shapes hearts and minds. Silence has allowed its influence to grow unchecked, particularly among the young, and the need for Christian accountability. This brings me to a painful realization. We must call out fellow Christians who shrink from this fight. After Kirk's murder, a respected Christian leader posted, quote, it's okay for Christians to lose a culture war. It was never our war to begin with. We were called to create a countercultural community of love, unity, and faithfulness to Jesus. I once shared this view, but I now see it as a misdiagnosis. By framing the conflict as merely cultural, we avoid confronting its religious nature. This mindset discourages Christians from engaging with the urgency Paul describes. We are not called to retreat into isolated communities, but to contend for truth in the public square. This doesn't mean adopting the world's tactics, anger, division, violence, but speaking with clarity and courage, as Paul did, to expose falsehoods and point to Christ. Failing to do so risks abandoning millions to a worldview that promises salvation, but delivers bondage. So a path forward. I don't claim to have all the answers. I recognize that labeling leftism as a religion may provoke disagreement. Some might argue it's still a political movement, best addressed through dialogue or voting, not spiritual confrontation. Others may caution that focusing on this fight distracts from evangelism or risks alienating those we're called to reach. These are valid concerns, but they don't negate the need to name and challenge a worldview that rivals the gospel's claims. The path forward is not easy. It requires discernment to engage without malice, boldness to speak without fear, and humility to listen without compromise. We must build communities that model Christ's love while equipping men and women to confront false ideologies with truth. The war is not cultural. It's religious. And as disciples of Jesus, we're called to fight it with the weapons of grace, truth, and especially now, courage. So that's kind of the way that I've been processing it. Phil, I loved your comment. I'll read this after you have a chance to kind of respond to the essay again. But yeah, how you talked about the hierarchy, you kind of brought this into a philosophical, theological lens I thought was really helpful. But yeah, any other ways that you're kind of reacting to this moment culturally, or this idea that we're kind of in a religious battle?
Right. Well, I loved your essay. I think you captured a feeling that is really prominent among a lot of Christians who have had similar instincts about political engagement, because there are valid reasons to hesitate about, really inserting oneself into political debates and, what is a culture war. And yet, I think the events of this last week and a bit more have revealed there's something more than just political debates going on here. There really are spiritual. I mean, that spiritual is the best word to describe the kind of forces we're sort of seeing at work. and I have really benefited from the analysis I've read from others about leftism. And of course, there's going to be, we may need to define that carefully, because you can be a political liberal without being a leftist in the way that you mean it. And I think describing it as a religious, functioning as a religion in those people's lives is correct. That is simply to be honest about what we're seeing. And I like that line you had about, that what we saw in terms of the reaction to Charlie Kirk's assassination was this kind of a ritualistic rejection of a heretic. There is this rejoicing that this heretic has been eliminated because he was a vehicle for intolerable ideas. And so we have a kind of a zero-sum battle in these people's minds. It's no longer sufficient to debate in civil society. It's time to take up arms, and that is a fundamental undermining of the democratic system that we've inherited from previous generations, and that goes to my comment. But what are some of the reasons that Christians have avoided culture wars? I think that there's some legit ones, like because we have all seen so-called Christians, and perhaps they are, but people, claiming the name of Christ, but who are clearly subsuming their Christian convictions to partisan political ends, right? You see, I always get a little queasy when I see religious leaders in the Oval Office or in the White House, and there's all this, all this, this mixing of politics and people who claim to be ministers of the gospel, and I get uncomfortable because politics is a dirty business, and so there's something. I think that instinct to be cautious about entering into the political sphere is very understandable. I don't know if you want to expand on that at all, but I want to be sympathetic to the feeling that has held you back until now, let's say, of pronouncing confidently about these types of issues.
Yeah. I think, and this is part of what has erupted in recent years around the idea of Christian nationalism. How much should we actually attempt to become a political force within the country? And yeah, my take on politics has always been, when Jesus said to Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world," I think that was just like something like in the fabric of reality, sort of separated. And that at that moment, I think Jesus unveiled to his followers, "Look, I'm going to hold this political leader accountable, but I'm not trying to win a kingdom here, like in the same way. Like my kingdom is now." Jesus does, and then after the resurrection, he says, "All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me." And so this is where you can find certainly ammunition for either side of these ideas in the New Testament. And so you have to somehow synthesize them into a cohesive position. And I would say that what Jesus does is he sets up a parallel kingdom. The word ecclesia, that we translate church, it was primarily a political word in the first century. It was the assembly of people when they were getting together to govern a village or a region. And I think that when Jesus said, "I will build my ecclesia," he was saying, I'm going to have a government, and I will rule that government. But I'm because our call is to make disciples, because after he was given all authority, he could have just as easily said, "All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, therefore go conquer, all of these different nations, and force them into obedience to the only true legitimate kingdom on earth. That is my kingdom." Like, he could have said that, but instead he said, "All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, therefore go and make disciples," which what he is, and of all nations. And what he's saying there is that the process that we go through to bring people into the kingdom is a process of discipleship, not violence, not through conquering, not like the kind of the way that Muhammad went about this, which was a similar claim, but he offered to his followers what would have been very intuitive to the claim that there's only one God and there's only one Lord, and that is, why wouldn't you conquer through violence? Like that's a reasonable assumption to make if you think that there's only one legitimate God and one legitimate Lord. Jesus does not offer us that option. There's a lot of stories in the Gospels where I think he's confronting the tension between those two things.
You're right. Like that is the expected human response. Especially, it may be a little bit hard for us, because we've got centuries of sort of democratic political systems, to look back upon. But in the ancient world, I mean, we're talking about a brutal
Yes.
reality of conquering and murdering, and no one really thought twice about that approach to taking control of this or that country, nation or tribe or whatever it is. So yeah, Jesus's kingdom is a radically novel idea.
Yes.
It transcends human politics.
Yes.
But at the same time, any group of people with shared convictions becomes a political reality, especially, I mean, you see that in the Roman Empire when the church begins to grow. There are political ramifications to the growth of the kingdom of God. And those are messy. They're hard to parse. I mean, church history is messy. It's not clean and tidy. And God works in and through very imperfect people and systems and efforts to accomplish his purposes. And so I'm left with the, like you said, I find it hard to have a comprehensive and clean sort of vision for how this is all supposed to work.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a number of tensions that are at work, and you have to kind of navigate them carefully. And I think in this article, you're putting your finger on something very important, that when a political ideology rises to function as a religious reality in people's lives, then the conflict is spiritual on some level.
Right.
I think we've seen this with like really committed progressive leftists. Like they're not really open to debate. And they have a comprehensive mission in terms of what they want to accomplish. And maybe that gets to my comment about they're trying to replace, kind of the apex of what holds our civilization together.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to read this comment you made, Phil. I will say one thing too about, I mentioned Ezra Klein, who's a liberal, and wrote, that article that got him in a lot of trouble, by the way.
Oh, really?
He said he's never been attacked more in his entire life than writing an article that Charlie Kirk did politics right. And I think that one of the things that Ezra Klein discovered, and Bill Maher, also a liberal who's not really a leftist, he's an atheist. I assume Ezra Klein is probably an atheist as well. And these guys, one of the things that is interesting about them is they have some kind of inherent belief that the truth will win, that we need to have open dialogue, that it's better to have free speech and to lose in the marketplace of ideas than to resort to violence. That's actually a really unusual position. It's very much a Christian position. Like this very much goes in line with the fact that we are following the model of a Lord who took violence off the table, yet saw ideas and again how they become faith as ultimately meaningful. Yet you're not going to use violence to actually, like, those things. There's a really profound tension in that, and Jesus said no. We will not, and it's spreading our faith. And I think that when Ezra Klein and Bill Maher are making these statements, they are making fundamentally Christian assumptions about the nature of the tension between ideas and why free speech must be an absolute kind of prerequisite to the conversation. And I think what leftists have discovered, and this is why I wanted to frame it this way, leftists are actually more consistent in some ways, because if you get rid of Christianity, I don't know how why would you imagine a situation where you think ideas are ultimately meaningful. You don't have any example from Christ. You simply have the logical assumption that ideas and what people believe in actually is the most meaningful thing about their lives and can lead people down a road where it destroys their lives. Like if you believe, for example, that trying to communicate to somebody who's transgender that's not an option to them, that literally, erases their existence and destroys the most important part of who they are. That is their identity. It becomes difficult to argue, if you don't believe in Jesus, some kind of ultimate moral framework for this, that we don't resort to violence to convince people of our ideas. Then it's very easy to slip into a belief that that violence is acceptable. In fact, there was a couple of famous surveys that came out this week. I think one was something like over 50% of Gen Z believes that violence is appropriate response to some forms of speech. And then Harvard, I posted this, I think it was 32 or 34% of Harvard students believe that violence is an appropriate response to some forms of speech. Again, this is really what you're seeing there is sort of people finally coming out from under a Christ centered idea, and this is why the idea that our system of government came from the Enlightenment, that those are such clearly bankrupt ideas without the underpinning of Christianity, without there being a Judeo-Christian foundation to everything that we believe. There are so many foundational elements of this system that we're all a part of that just disintegrate, and that is predictable. And I feel like we haven't really dealt with that. So let me read what you wrote here, Phil, because I thought this was really helpful. You said, well said, I've been thinking over the idea that every civilization that has ever existed was built on a sacred order, including ours. Some hierarchy holds it together with something sacred at the top, which must not be blasphemed. And therefore, every civilization has something with which not to be blasphemed, because it is the keystone. It feels very much like leftism tried hard to install its sacred principle of unfettered human autonomy, from which flows sexual liberation from bodily limits, in the last decade. And that struggle was what animated so much of the culture war over wokeism and the new levels of social control over what could and couldn't be said. And now with the assassination of Charlie Kirk and the unhinged bloodthirstiness exhibited by the leftists, it seems like a collective moment where the rest of the society is saying, we don't want that. We don't want to celebrate the public murder of a peaceful activist. And we don't want to tolerate people who celebrate violence against nonviolent political figures. So it feels like this core Western principle of nonviolent political disagreement is being thrust back to the top of the hierarchy. So I love like the visual way you're describing, like look at what's at the top, and there's a fight going on, and things are being pulled and pushed up and down the hierarchy. So it feels like this core Western principle of nonviolent political disagreement is being thrust back to the top of the hierarchy, displacing unfettered human autonomy. In that sense, yes, it's a religious war. It's not easy to parse out how each individual Christian leader, Christian institution ought to participate. We do not all have the same vocation, but your points above are valid, and I think you expressed well the experience that many are having of reconsidering their lack of direct involvement opposing leftism. So yeah, thoughts on like that. I think I really appreciated the fact that like we need to understand this sort of theological sort of tension or theological reality that in every society there is this war that about what goes on the top of the hierarchy, and your statement about like blaspheming that becomes how you sort of determine what that sacred keystone really is.
Yeah, and just to give credit where credit is due, I'm borrowing some of these ideas from other thinkers and writers. Obviously, I'm not coming up with this myself. I know that the idea of sacred order being at the top of a hierarchy and it gives rise to a social order, that's derived from the thought of 20th century Jewish thinker called Philip Rieff, who I haven't read directly. Apparently, he's very difficult to read, but a number of thoughtful people have sort of appropriated his thought and popularized it. And I found it, like you said, there's something intuitively enlightening about thinking of it that way. Like, yes, there is something that holds a civilization together, because if you don't have that, then all you have is the threat of force, which maybe you see in a totalitarian system. Like, what holds a totalitarian system together? Fear of the violence that the government can impose. But in a society which is largely free or has a measure of freedom, you got to have something which is kind of in the heart of everyone that we're all agreed on is the most important thing. And I think our civilization, now that it's sort of, we've been post-Christian for some time, um, and we're seeing how bankrupt our liberal system is without that Christian soil to give it nutrition, which is what gave rise to the principles we enjoy, like free speech and religious freedom. These are Christian ideas fundamentally. We're seeing that sort of fall apart. And yeah, when I think about the last 10 years and this woke moment that we've had, and of course we're still in it to a large extent because it has so much institutional power, but it really does feel like new blasphemy laws were kind of imposed on everyone. Like, you can't speak of things this way. You can't say a transgender man is really a woman or the other way around. And this is the unforgivable sin, right? And people were getting canceled and losing their jobs and basically being expelled from polite society, from the public square. And a lot of people kind of went along with it because it seemed like it was, I don't know, like the arc of history. This is the next phase in moral progress.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's compassionate. Thank you. It's we weaponized empathy to those ends.
Good.
And I think there's something about the ruthlessness of the murder of Charlie Kirk and the subsequent celebration of it by the same people who were pushing all of these new realities on us. And so then a lot of like regular folks are saying, I don't like this. No, I don't want this.
Right.
And
yeah.
And I'm hopeful that we can come back from the edge.
Yeah.
Because one thing you learn when you study history a little bit is how thin the line is between social order and chaotic violence. Totally. The breakdown of society. You look,
political violence sadly is the norm in human history, and it's still in most parts of the world. It's just that's what people don't understand. That we're the exception. There's something strange that needs to be studied about what has happened in Western civilizations. And this is why the hey-ho Western civ has to go. Like, people didn't realize that, okay, like you have to understand that there's something really bizarre that occurred in Western civilization. That's why we study it, because we're trying to preserve this very strange experiment that seems to have created a political system that doesn't devolve into violence predictably the way most systems do. Now, the thing that I'm trying to understand, Phil, and I want to and you see this, I'm just beginning my process here of trying to understand what was the line of thinking that, for me, led to an error on my part. And as I've really tried to search my heart and say, why is this difficult for me to disentangle these things? How do I confuse the political and the religious? I think that part of it is that when you are invested or immersed in political and cultural conversations, I need to make sure that I'm first and foremost like a theological thinker. And so I need to be able to, when I'm hearing an idea, even if it's coming out of the mouth of a politician, even if it's coming out of the mouth of a political activist, I need to be able to discern when I'm hearing a religious idea. And I need to quickly and categorize that separately and say, okay, we were having a great conversation about politics. All right, this is really interesting. We're all basically operating from the same Judeo-Christian foundations of the way we're thinking about politics, but you have more, liberal ideas about this particular policy. I have some more conservative ideas. We can discuss that. But all of a sudden, interjected in the conversation is a religious idea, a new religious idea, one that violates Christianity and posits a different religious system. Like, I feel like I need to have some kind of alarm bell that goes off. Like, oh, what just happened? Like, you just elevated the conversation to the next level. Like, we were talking about politics, now we're talking about religion. And to be able to engage in that conversation in that way. And so I think that's what happened. But again, they're not talking like that. It's one thing if I'm having a conversation with a Muslim, like, I'm assuming that everything he's saying, even if he says something political, even if he says, hey, in Saudi Arabia, we don't, let women drive for these reasons, I still would probably primarily categorize that as a religious statement, even though it's a very, very specific policy decision within a particular, governing authority. I'm like, I know that comes from a religious conviction. It's not simply a cultural thing. It's not simply a political thing. There's something within Islam that is causing that to happen in that country and in those countries. And I think that's not happening for me when I'm listening to political discourse in my own context. I still have this bias that assumes we're all basically operating from a similar religious framework. Even if you're an atheist, you're for some reason really, championing the ideas of Jesus in the way that you think about things like the First Amendment or the equality of all humans and all of that. But yeah, I'm trying to sensitize
Right.
myself to stop this miscategorization.
It's a great question, Jeremy. I don't think that I have a complete answer, but I'll just sort of riff on my own thinking that I think can be helpful, has been helpful for me, and that's just focusing on the part about what the Bible clearly teaches about the human person, right? What we might call a biblical anthropology. What is the human person? How have we been created? To what ends? What characterizes our propensities, our weaknesses, our strengths? And my conviction is that this is fundamentally a stable reality. Human nature doesn't change fundamentally over time. And I think one of the hallmarks of revolutionary political ideas in the modern era, starting with Marxism, has been the rejection of a basically biblical view of the human person. And so Marxism taught that you can consider humanity or human person a blank slate, and if you apply enough pressure socially, or if you take children young enough and educate them, you can reshape them to be fundamentally different. And that experiment has been tried and has yielded horrible results. And leftism has carried on this idea. In fact, it has amped it up. And I feel like this is almost like it feels to me like the nub of the issue, even for other issues that we're facing as a society. What is your view of the human person? Because if you think that there is no stable category of male and female, then transgenderism makes sense. If you don't think that there's a stable category of humanity and the human nature, and that we're just the result of blind evolutionary forces, then there's no guardrail to keep you from pursuing transhumanism and the endless upgrading of human minds and bodies, and the commodification of human birth that we're seeing through designer babies, genetic editing, surrogacy, all these things. So I feel like I don't think it's a complete answer to what you're thinking about, but when I hear ideas that assume a fundamentally different understanding of the human person, that is it's such a fundamental, basic part of any system that will arise, for society, that to me, that's a religious category.
Yeah, this is where we need to become a lot more first principle thinkers, so your point. So it's really important to understand someone's anthropology. If they think that human beings are essentially good, then oftentimes a result of that kind of thinking, it sounds really nice. It's like, wow, I really, really want to affirm that. Like you look at a baby or a child and you're like, of course they're good. Like they just look so innocent. The problem, of course, is that what happens to the way you think is if they start to do something wrong, sinful, evil, then if they're essentially a good person, then some system from the outside came and corrupted that poor child. And that
Yes.
therefore you can never hold that person responsible. You always think that there's got to be some change that we have to enforce on the system to save the children, to save humanity. And that's a really dangerous move because that leads to a kind of totalitarianism. Why wouldn't you, if you did believe that, if you believe that people were basically good, if we had the perfect system in government, everybody would be good all the time, basically, because that's every corrupting influence comes from the outside. Then of course you would spend all of your time trying to reshape the systems of society and using whatever level of power you possibly could to do that, to be able to save these future generations. But of course, if you believe like Christians do, that humans are sort of bent from birth. Like there's something in our nature that's actually pulling us towards evil, and that if you just let people go according to their own devices, then they're going to come to some conclusions that are highly selfish, that are destructive to relationships, and that are ultimately in rebellion against God. And that process of working with them is something that has to happen from the inside out. This kind of gives you these two orientations: an outside in orientation and an inside out orientation. And as judgmental as it sounds to say, no, every human being is born with this sin nature, man, that just creates a society in which there's way more grace for each other, a lot more like a desire to like come into dialogue with each other and say, hey, I want to, there is something I want to help you see this, because if your heart and your head and your spirit really come alive to truth, then that can come and heal that sinful nature that's going to otherwise corrupt and take over. And not to mention the fact that we believe in in an actual spiritual realm, that there is personal evil out there that is tempting and trying to grab a hold of people's sinful nature. And so all of these things cause us to have the ability to have a lot of grace, but also to go through the difficult process of dialogue, of discipleship, the kinds of tools that help us to convince and persuade people, as opposed to force people or grab levers of power that give us the ability to sort of reshape society regardless of what people believe or are experiencing. So yeah, this is, I think I need to understand these categories much more clearly, so that because when I think about like even what I described, people like Ezra Klein or Bill Maher, I would guess that they probably religiously reject those elements of the foundations of Christianity. In other words, I'd be surprised if Ezra Klein didn't believe that people were basically good. And maybe that's what makes him a liberal. But it doesn't make him a leftist, because he's also believes he's taken some elements of Judeo-Christianity, like the equality of value of the human person, but rejected other elements of our theology, like the sin nature. And so he's got this amalgam of things that he believes, some of which are consistent with Christianity, some of which are deeply inconsistent. But what leftists believe is they've really rejected a larger percentage. And this is, again, why I think it can be a bit bewitching to try to disentangle the political and the religious. So this has been really helpful. Yeah. Any other last thoughts you have, Phil, before we close up today?
Yeah. One thought which is sobering is, Charlie Kirk was definitely a very politically partisan figure, and I'm not interested in parsing sort of what I agree or not about his views exactly, but he was absolutely a nonviolent figure, and he was a public Christian. And so I think the sobering thing is, like, he represents generally, the views of a huge amount of people in America and North America and the West. And so one of the things that people have reflected on since his assassination, and perhaps even more troubling, has been the reaction of so many leftists of celebrating it, is like, well, you're celebrating the death of someone who holds basically the same views I do, or at least according to you, you'd have a hard time distinguishing my views from his, right? So I might want to draw some fine distinctions, but on basic biblical moral issues, yeah, I would agree with him being anti-abortion and all this stuff. And you're celebrating his public execution in front of his family. Like, that's so dehuman. It's so inhuman and brutal.
Yeah.
And part of what scares me is, if he represents the Christian right to some extent, there is such a thing as the post-Christian right. And it's not opposed to violence. And, and I think liberals and leftists tend to conflate those two groups of, people who have sort of quasi-conservative or libertarian ideas, call them the right wing. And then, it shades into some ugly fascist, right wing stuff. And by killing the Christian right and treating it as the same, you're stoking the fires of the post-Christian right, and it's ugly. And I don't want to see that rise. I don't want to see more young men being drawn to violent ideologies and rehashing Hitler's legacy like we see on Twitter. And I hope that's a whole bunch of bots, but there's a movement there of people reacting against leftism in their own, in another ugly ideology on the right. And so that is definitely a concern.
Yeah, that's really important to call out. Like there is a way this story goes with, and you can see the fulcrum point in all of this is Jesus himself. This is
Mm,
where Jesus is lifted up. Jesus is the reason why liberals are nonviolent. Jesus is the reason why conservatives are nonviolent. And if you take Jesus away enough from either side, you will end up getting a reaction that's predictably more violent and maybe very violent. So we have to be aware that we really hold, as Christians and believers in Jesus, the only solution to this problem, which is the gospel itself and people's faith in Jesus and lifting him up as we worship him, we are discipled by him, we study and follow his teachings, and that we need to be holding accountable Christians to being like Jesus at times like this. But this also means calling out having difficult conversations, calling out false religions, and really doing it in a way that is very persuasive and very stark and clear, but also violent. John Adams, this quote has, I think, really, really helped me frame this understanding, right? He said, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." And that was such a prophetic statement that if Christianity falls away, this Constitution will not save us because it's founded on something. And so we need people that are trying to follow Jesus and are actively thinking about morality from that lens in order for this Constitution to actively hold together this otherwise very diverse society religiously. That there is something like foundational about Christianity itself. It's not just religion. It's you can't just take a leftist religion and insert it and think the Constitution is going to save you or make sense within that framework. It makes sense within a particular framework. Well, thanks, Phil, so much for jumping on here today. This is like hard things to work through, but yeah, this is how I like to do it. Just like really talking it out, getting your feedback. Thank you for jumping on and on the podcast, on the Substack, and helping me think through this. It's been really good for me.
Oh, my pleasure, Jeremy.
Thank you for listening to Jeremy Pryor's podcast. Make sure you hit that follow button so you don't miss out on any future content. Follow Jeremy on Twitter and Instagram, as well as his Substack blog, all linked in the description. See you next time.